This is really important and very, very strange. What's up, boils and ghouls? A couple weeks ago, I posted a video about breaking down the Halloween franchise because that franchise is confusing as hell. And I got some positive feedback that people appreciated trying to sort through the wackiness of that franchise. And I thought, are there any other franchises out there that might be as confusing as Halloween? And then it dawned on me, yes, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is also incredibly confusing. Much like the Halloween franchise, the first movie in the Texas Chainsaw franchise is considered an all-time classic horror movie that lands on many people's top 10, if not top 5 horror movies of all time, and for good reason. But also like the Halloween franchise, the rest of the entries in the franchise have been met with mixed reactions. It's also gotten various prequels, reboots, remakes, and Lego sequels. So I'm going to try and break down the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise for you. Luckily, there's only 8 movies total, so hopefully things go a little bit more quickly. Before I dive in, please hit the subscribe button and like, comment, all that good stuff. And now here we go. The original timeline, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Next Generation. First things first. The original 1974 movie, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is spelled chain saw. 2 words. Every other entry in the franchise spells it chainsaw. When you see people spelling the original movie chainsaw, that is correct. When it's spelled chainsaw, when talking about the first movie, that's not technically correct. This is a very pedantic argument, but it's one that I needed to address right off the bat because I am pedantic, and most likely you are too. In that original movie, directed by Tobe Hooper, a group of friends are on a road trip through Texas when they face some car trouble, or technically van trouble, because they're all driving in a big van. When they pull their van over and go out in search of some assistance, they stumble across the Sawyer household. And the first person who goes up to the house sees weird bones and taxidermy, only for a masked figure to emerge to smack him on the head with a hammer and slam a metal door shut. The movie has been weird up until this point, especially thanks to the hitchhiker that these friends pick up that takes pictures of them and cuts himself and burns the Polaroid and just generally creepy stuff. So when this giant figure, who we'll come to know and love as Leatherface, grabs this individual and then just slams the door shut behind them, this is when we know things are getting real. These friends start getting picked off one by one, and ultimately Sally is the last one to survive. She realizes that this deranged family that consists of the hitchhiker and Leatherface and the person who runs the gas station that they stopped at earlier, as well as a decrepit old man who can barely swing a hammer to crush her skull. They're all part of the same insane family, and they're all cannibals who like to torture and kill people. Luckily, Sally manages to escape. She runs out of the house, she jumps out of a window and then runs to the road. A man in a pickup truck stops, manages to get her in the bed of his truck. She drives off. Leatherface is left swinging a chainsaw up in the air wildly like a maniac. It's all absolutely psychotic and all absolutely horrifying. What really ends up making the movie feel so effective is it was filmed in the early 70s. It was shot on 16 millimeter. So there's definitely a grimy documentary feel about the whole experience. This is also years before not just Halloween, but also before Black Christmas, which many people point to as the birth of the slasher concept. Texas Chainsaw Massacre doesn't even feel like a slasher, not only by contemporary terms, but even they just didn't even have the language to describe what type of movie that was. I would say it ultimately feels like a slasher movie, given that you have a masked killer killing people, but it is both a slasher and so much more than that. The movie opens with a narration that tries to claim that the events of the movie are based on true events. So between the look of the film and that opening narration, audiences were just confused at what the hell they were seeing. They thought they were seeing something that really did happen. And there are elements of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Leatherface that are based on Ed Gein. Ed Gein did dig up corpses and cut them apart and desecrate these corpses, turn their bodies into furniture, which is a direct inspiration for what you see in the Texas Chainsaw. So the look, the feel, and even the story itself feels terrifyingly like something ripped from the headlines. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 came out in 1986, so more than a decade after the original movie. Tobe Hooper returns to direct Texas Chainsaw 2. And this is where things take a turn for the better, for the worse. Who's really to say? What happened was Tobe Hooper didn't appreciate that the original movie was only being praised for the more horrifying elements of it. And he was a little frustrated that people didn't pick up on the inherent black humor that he was trying to explore in that original movie. So with part two, he really doubled down on the comedy. People either loved that turn or they hated that turn. In that sequel, two teenagers are driving through Texas and they call in a radio show only to be killed by Leatherface. The DJ records their killing inadvertently. And when Sally and Franklin, the siblings from the first movie, when their uncle hears that tape, he realizes that he might be able to track down Leatherface and the Sawyer family to get revenge for what happened to his niece and nephew. The uncle is played by Dennis Hopper, and he's an absolute madman in this who is nearly as deranged as Leatherface himself. The uncle, known as Lefty, asks the DJ, known as Stretch, to play the recording on the air so that way he might be able to get some leads from the radio listening public. When Drayton Sawyer, the barbecue cooker from the original movie, and Chop Top, who is Leatherface's brother and the twin brother of the hitchhiker from the first movie, when they hear the tape being played, they go to the radio station to try to kill Stretch. They kidnap Stretch and take them back to their compound, which is an underground lair slash abandoned amusement park, and keep Stretch captive. Lefty manages to follow the Sawyer family back to their underground lair to have a showdown using giant chainsaws, and everybody ends up either chainsawing themselves or hand grenading each other. At the end of the movie, the only person left is Stretch, who wields a chainsaw maniacally, much like Leatherface did at the end of the first movie. A lot of the absurdity of the first movie is much more unsettling than necessarily entertaining or anything that makes you laugh. So it's easy to see how Chainsaw 2 isn't a complete divergence from the original movie. It just amplifies the more slapstick, sillier elements from the first movie to a higher degree to make it much more obvious that you're not supposed to be terrified of how eccentric the Sawyer family is, so much as you're supposed to be laughing at them. So at this point, it's worth noting that even though I refer to these first four movies as being the original timeline, the next two movies don't really have all that much narrative connection to the original two movies, other than they're about Leatherface and the Sawyer family exists and their horror movies. With Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Part 3, it was originally shot and got an X rating, but given that this was the early 90s, the studio knew that they wouldn't really make much money if they tried to release an X-rated movie, so the violence and the gore got trimmed down so that they could earn an R rating. This movie also tried to tone down the overt comedy from the previous movie and return the series back to its seemingly hardcore horror roots that its fans celebrated more than the comedy. In this movie, A couple is traveling through Texas when they pick up a hitchhiker named Tex, played by a then unknown Viggo Mortensen. And when they see Tex get into a fight with someone at a gas station thinking he gets killed, they go out in search of Tex to try to track him down and make sure that he's okay. Bad news for this couple is Tex is actually a member of the Sawyer family and Leatherface is his brother. The movie follows all the things you would expect a 1990 slasher movie called Leatherface to follow, where there's chase scenes and Leatherface kills people and wears weird masks, and the main character gets away, but not without hearing Leatherface somewhere off in the distance revving his chainsaw. The movie is ultimately pretty forgettable. It was clearly an attempt to revive the dormant franchise despite only a few years having passed between part 2 and part 3. But obviously, the filmmakers, the studio wanted to make Leatherface an icon that would rival Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger. That's not to say that Leatherface isn't without its fans. Die-hard Texas Chainsaw fans definitely find things to like about the movie. Viggo Mortensen is a good actor, so that was pretty evident from even a movie like this. But for the most part, it was a critical and commercial failure that stagnated the franchise. Part 4 of the franchise is known sometimes as The Return of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but more commonly known as Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation. It was written and directed by Kim Henkel, who co-wrote the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre with Tobe Hooper. So I think there was some hope and expectation that this would finally be the entry that brought the franchise back to its original glory. And that didn't happen. Texas Chainsaw: The Next Generation follows a group of teens who face some car trouble and wander around through the Texan countryside in the middle of the night. And when they are promised that they will get some help from someone nearby, they do not get the help. Instead, they meet Vilmer, played by Matthew McConaughey, who has a cybernetic leg and is a member of the Sawyer family. His brother is Leatherface. We go on to learn that there's a secret society who is controlling the Sawyer family and encouraging them to terrorize people. And there's lots of running and lots of screaming and lots of chainsaws killing people. Other than the overall major concept that the Sawyer family is part of an ongoing secret society that terrorizes people, the movie doesn't really break new ground. It clearly tried to channel some of the absurdity of Texas Chainsaw 2 and how Chop Top was the predecessor to Matthew McConaughey's character, because Matthew McConaughey, also good actor, so he amplified the insanity and the absurdity of the situation. Renee Zellweger is also in this movie as one of the teens who is being tormented by the Sawyer family. So they're both good actors. One of the things that I think makes Leatherface interesting, especially in these 4 movies, is that he, unlike Michael Myers, where there's supposed to be a consistency to his disguise, he is constantly pivoting from one outfit to the next. Some of these disguises are a bit more brutal and intimidating. He feels like a butcher. In the original movie, he also wears a suit at one point toward the end of the movie. However, once we get to 2, 3, and 4, he is dressing as a woman, sometimes apparently a younger woman, other times an old lady. It all is very strange and very bizarre. And so in that sense, I think Leatherface is a much more interesting and a much more frightening character than Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger, the evolution that this character goes through. However, from here on out, the movies basically just tried to make him as terrifying as possible. Looking back at these first 4 entries, you have the original movie, and then the second movie is directly inspired by that first movie. There's stronger thematic connections, stronger narrative connections. And then by Leatherface and Texas Chainsaw 4, all we really need to know is the fact that there's a guy out there with a chainsaw named Leatherface. They don't necessarily contradict the movies that come before them, so much as all you need to know is these movies are about a psycho with a chainsaw who's part of a cannibalistic family in Texas. The remake timeline: the Texas Chainsaw Massacre at the beginning, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. As you can tell, I placed these in narrative chronological order rather than the order in which they were released. Texas Chainsaw came out in 2003. The beginning came out in 2006. In my video about the Halloween franchise timeline, I mentioned how there were a whole bunch of horror remakes in the 2000s. A lot of them were produced by a company called Platinum Dunes, and arguably, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is what helped kick off that trend because it was a relative success when it was released in theaters. It had a whole bunch of hot people in it, and it was, for the most part, just a beat for beat reimagining or retelling of the core concept of a psychopath with a chainsaw and his deranged family. So when the 2003 movie was a success, we got the 2006 prequel, The Beginning. In The Beginning, we see a woman who dies while giving birth in a slaughterhouse, and the baby is found in a dumpster. 30 years go by, and this baby, who is now the grown Thomas, still works in the slaughterhouse, and when he is fired, he kills his boss with a hammer. Don't worry, he finds a chainsaw and walks home with it, and thus begins our journey with Leatherface. This movie takes place in the late 60s and follows a group of friends who are driving one of their friends. Truly, I'm just saying friends because who they are doesn't matter at all. Two of these friends are also brothers, and they're trying to enlist in the army, so they're making a road trip out of it because what a worse way to spend a car ride than to go through Texas knowing you're about to head to Vietnam. But if you thought that was bad, their terror is just about to begin. Along the way, these friends encounter some bikers and get to a fight with them and end up getting into a car crash and killing one of the bikers, and the authorities show up, or should I say, the authorities, and it is a member of the Hewitt family, not Sawyer this time around. They call themselves the Hewitt family. See, this is the genius of remaking and rebooting an iconic horror property is you can change their last names and it feels like a totally different experience. The sheriff who arrives is played by R. Lee Ermey, who is actually the older brother of Leatherface, but he promises to take care of the situation, brings these friends back to his house, claiming he'll get rid of the body because who cares? It's just a biker. These friends trust him, thinking he's genuinely trying to help them out of a bad situation. But bad news, he is a psycho, and so is the rest of his family. Everything that kind of happens when they get back to the family farm is pretty much what you expect. R. Lee Ermey terrorizes and torments these kids that he's brought back to his house. They run for help and get caught and get hurt and get stabbed, and there's meat hooks and bear traps and hammers and all of the expected cutlery that you would anticipate from a movie like this. Honestly, I don't think this movie is necessarily awful because it does lean into how talented R. Lee Ermey is and how frightening he is, and really emphasizes the whole family dynamic more than just being Leatherface running back and forth from one place to another. So by embracing the psychotic family tropes, it's not just a movie where Leatherface is the focal point of all of the terror. Before we got to have The Beginning, we had to have the 2003 remake. It touches all the major points of the original story. A group of friends traveling in a van have some car trouble, and they end up back at the Hewitt family farm. Remember, this isn't Sawyer, this is Hewitt. These friends pick up a hitchhiker who's a woman who seems traumatized from whatever the hell she just experienced. We come to sort of put together the fact that she managed to escape the Hewitt family. And when she realizes that these people who picked her up are driving in the direction of the Hewitt family's house, she pulls a gun from her, let's say, nether regions and shoots herself in the head. If nothing else about this movie, there's one single shot that really works well. And that's a shot where after she's shot herself in the mouth with the bullet going out the back of her head, the camera is shooting out the windshield and slowly pulls back. And we even travel out the hole in her head. Given that this took place before every single horror movie was using CGI to do their more compelling sequences, it was evident that the filmmaker was trying to do something different with the cinematography and with the camera moves, and that shot is still awesome. That shot aside, there's nothing much new to bring to the table with this 2003 remake of the original. It does look quite good. It doesn't have the same look or feel as the original movie. Instead, it has a higher gloss sheen on the whole thing. So you could tell that there was a lot more money involved in this production. Even if you might appreciate the look and the overall tone and vibe of this movie and some of the tweaks that they made along the way, it's still just Leatherface chasing people down. He's the big bad guy. He's the villain. He eventually chases Jessica Biel into the slaughterhouse and she hides in a locker or some crap. Really, who cares? She escapes. Leatherface is still on the loose, and so is his psychotic family. However, it doesn't really matter because this remake timeline only lasted 2 movies. The Lionsgate timeline: Leatherface, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Texas Chainsaw 3D. Similar to the remake timeline, this is a case where the prequel was released after the sequel. So Leatherface came out in 2017, was released very unceremoniously, whereas Texas Chainsaw 3D was one of many horror movies at the time that tried to take advantage of the popularity of 3D technology and served as a direct sequel to the original Texas Chainsaw. In Leatherface, which is set in the 50s, we see a psycho family who is luring people to their deaths. The father of one of the victims is the sheriff, and he throws one of the kids in a mental institution. And 10 years go by. This kid ultimately breaks out of the mental institution with some other inmates there, and they kidnap a nurse, bring them back to the Sawyer family farm. On their way back to the farm, these inmates get into a variety of different altercations. Meanwhile, the sheriff is trying to track them down because he knows that they've escaped. He knows that one of the inmates is the one who was at least partly responsible for the death of his daughter. So the Sawyer family ultimately comes and finds them and brings them back. Between the family dynamics, in addition to having the familial connection of the sheriff trying to get revenge for what happened to his daughter, Leatherface does try to blend together a lot of different ideas and components of all the previous entries of the Texas Chainsaw franchise. And it's also very, very violent. It's definitely one of the more gruesome entries. It's not that there's anything even particularly bad about the movie. It was just something that nobody really asked for. We never really asked for another Leatherface origin story. Admittedly, this is only the second one that we got, but even one is too many. We do learn that the Sawyer family member, Jedediah, who gets sent to the mental institution, despite for most of the movie seeming like a competent, sympathetic individual, he's ultimately injured by a bullet shot by the sheriff, and he has his face disfigured. So he has his face sewn up by his mom and then is given a mask to hide his deformity. At the end of the movie, he ends up using human faces to make his own masks. So the transition from misunderstood, sympathetic character to completely deranged psychopath with a messed up face kind of just comes out of nowhere and feels pretty forced. But given that this is an origin story, we're not left with many other options. Then this movie sets the stage for the events of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But by the time we get to Texas Chainsaw 3D, we got to talk about some stuff. Texas Chainsaw 3D is a direct sequel to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The script for Texas Chainsaw 3D was originally set in the 90s. However, when they made the movie, it didn't actually take place in the 90s. It took place in present day. So early 2010s. This is really important and very, very strange. In the original script, there is a character who is a baby that is found in the fallout of the events of the 1974 movie. So, in that original script that was set in the 90s, this baby grows up and is in their 20s. However, if you then set that movie in 2013, technically that baby would be 38 or 39. Okay, not weird. Who cares? Where it gets weird is the fact that, spoiler alert, this character is played by actress Alexandra Daddario. This is what Alexandra Daddario looks like in Texas Chainsaw 3D. Technically, this character is supposed to be 39. However, the actress herself was in her early 20s when she filmed this movie. Her character also is friends with a bunch of other people who are in their early to mid 20s. Even though nobody's age is explicitly stated, where there's a contradictory element of, they say, I'm only 23. How should I know that? I'm definitely not someone who's 39, but it is just very bizarre. This also isn't a case of, well, actually, maybe it takes place in the 90s, but it's just never explicitly stated. So it might have been released in 2013, but it definitely takes place in the 90s. No, they're using smartphones in this movie. What? And actually, back in 2019, I was interviewing Alexandra Daddario for a different movie, and I just asked her if she was aware of the fact that there was this discrepancy. And she said,
I think that this was a film that was made to sell in a certain way, and they decided to ignore some of the history of Texas Chainsaw, which I know hardcore fans that's been brought to my attention before. But they took creative license, and I think that we ended up with a really fun movie, and I'm lucky to have gotten a bowl. But I have heard that, but I was not aware when I was cast that was what was going on. But to be fair, I'm not sure that's the biggest plot hole.
so even the actress didn't really know what the hell was going on. And that's not a fault of hers so much as it's just a fault of the filmmakers not really caring at all that they created this plot hole. Anyways, all that aside, let's talk about what happens in Texas Chainsaw 3D. Texas Chainsaw 3D opens with a prologue set in the aftermath of the original movie where a bunch of vigilantes burn down the Sawyer household. A baby is found and taken somewhere. Years later, nearly 40 years later, we focus on Heather, finding out she gets to collect an inheritance. Heather and her friends take a road trip down to the newly acquired farmhouse as part of the inheritance. And when Heather arrives at the farmhouse with her friends, she's given a very specific letter that seemingly has some very important instructions in there, which she initially neglects to read. Bad for her, part of those instructions is, hey, Leatherface is in the basement. Just so you know, watch out, he's got a bad temper. Instead, Leatherface is let out of the basement for him to do all of the things that Leatherface loves to do, mainly using a chainsaw to chop things up. After working with the local authorities, Heather learns what happened to the Sawyer family and how their house was burned down. She has some empathy for them, not appreciating the vigilante justice, only to realize one of the people that she's been talking with has a vendetta against the Sawyer family and hopes to kill them. He actually then uses Heather as bait to try to lure Leatherface. But through this whole process, we learn that Leatherface is technically Heather's cousin. Leatherface also realizes that they are family members when he sees a birthmark on her chest and doesn't kill her. Instead, Heather and Leatherface team up or something to become Heatherface, if you will, to take out the guy who lured her there. This movie gave us the line of Heather giving Leatherface the chainsaw and telling him,
Do your thing, cuz.
Because he's her cousin. And the movie ends with the two of them going back to their farmhouse. As far as sequels to horror movies that no one asked for, Texas Chainsaw 3D, all of that insanity about the timeline aside, it's fine. It tried to make use of the 3D technology, so maybe in theaters, if you got the chance to see it in theaters, it was a better experience than trying to watch it on home video. I don't remember the 3D being quite as overt and obvious as in something like Friday the 13th Part 3, where they're constantly pointing at the camera and things come flying at the camera. So these three movies from the Lionsgate timeline end up becoming sort of a standalone trilogy with the addition of Leatherface and Texas Chainsaw 3D. They're not much better and not much worse than the reboot movies. They just don't bring anything all that new to the table. Legendary timeline, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So it's worth noting that legendary timeline means not the quality of the movies, but Legendary produced the second movie of this timeline. I think knowing that Legendary was involved in reviving the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, people were initially excited because Legendary was involved in Batman Begins and Inception and Trick or Treat and the new Godzilla Monsterverse. There was lots of excitement. Clearly, this was a company that was passionate about putting new, fresh spins on classic titles. The people involved in all of the successful Legendary productions were clearly giant fans of the things that they were trying to revive, and a lot of them turned out really well. But Texas Chainsaw Massacre didn't quite get the same outcome. Part of it was due to the fact that it was being developed during the pandemic. So there were lots of obstacles along the way that the movie had to try to overcome. And it eventually just landed on Netflix in 2022 without all that much excitement, and for good reason. This Texas Chainsaw was meant to be a quote unquote direct sequel. So essentially, you didn't need to know anything about what happened in any of the other timelines or any of the other sequels. However, there's nothing that directly contradicted what happened in those movies. In this Texas Chainsaw, a group of entrepreneurs goes to a small town in Texas that was close to the events of what happened in the original Texas Chainsaw. And their plan is to buy up the property, to gentrify it, and turn it into this influencer focused community with high end restaurants and bars and nightclubs and all the garbage that comes with influencers. However, when they move in, they meet an old woman who claims that she actually owns the property and they can't buy it. And they get into an argument. The woman then collapses and has to be taken to the hospital. This woman dies on her way to the hospital, and we realize that Leatherface lives in her house, and he's not too happy about the fact that she died. So, as influencers are carted in by the busload, Leatherface goes on a rampage, goes through the entire school bus, killing and chopping and dismembering everyone he comes across, and this complicates the plan of the entrepreneurs. Luckily, not all hope is lost because Sally Hardesty, who experienced the horrible events of the original movie, is now a Texas Ranger. She hears that Leatherface is up to his old tricks of chainsawing people and goes to the town to try to stop him. Sally does track down Leatherface, and her and the survivors of his carnage of this small town of entrepreneur, influencers, whoever that, it doesn't matter. All these people confront Leatherface. Leatherface kills Sally. The other people who just came to town try to escape, but before dying, Sally tells them that they shouldn't run because if they just run instead of confronting Leatherface, they'll be haunted by this incident forever. It's clear that this movie was trying to do for Leatherface what the 2018 Halloween did for Laurie Strode and Michael Myers. Try to show that Sally being able to escape and never really knowing what happened to Leatherface impacted her entire life. And it's sort of interesting to try and create an emotional arc for any of these characters. But by now, unlike with Halloween, where we get protagonists that we care about, this franchise has just been about Leatherface and what sort of wacky things he gets up to with his family. Ultimately, Leatherface survives the whole thing. He chops a woman's head off. One of the victims survives and gets into a self-driving car. And as drives her away from the small town, she sees Leatherface with a decapitated head dancing around in the street. And it's all pretty dumb, unfortunately. I almost appreciate what this movie was trying to do, but one of the victims who survived the whole ordeal also was a school shooter survivor. So it was trying to create some sort of empathy for the emotional trauma of experiencing horrifying events and the toll it takes on you throughout the rest of your life. That way, she connected with Sally over the trauma of having survivor's guilt. I don't know. None of it really worked. No one really liked this movie. It went on Netflix and people have already forgotten it existed. And that's the end of the Legendary timeline so far. So that'll kind of wrap things up for the explanation of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise timeline. It's not quite as confusing as Halloween because you don't have a timeline that is constantly jumping back and forth and contradicting other timelines, having to think of some movies as canon, but not other movies. It's typically just, hey, we want to revive the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. Let's just do a direct sequel, or let's do a remake, or let's do a prequel, or whatever the hell. Everyone's trying to ride the coattails of how incredible that original movie is. Currently, A24, Paramount, Netflix, they're all trying to move forward with new Texas Chainsaw projects. Jordan Peele, Oz Perkins, Glenn Powell, a whole bunch of people are all trying to put their own spin on it. Whatever the future of this franchise is, hopefully someone does something exciting with it and doesn't just say, hey, let's make a movie where there's a guy with a chainsaw and a mask made of human skin. Even though those are integral components of the franchise, we already have 8 movies like that. So I really hope that whoever lands the rights and gets to move forward officially gets to do something a little bit more interesting. Hopefully you like this video. Feel free to hit that subscribe button down below to see more videos like this. Give me a like, give me a comment. Let me know if this just complicated things further or if maybe this helped set the record straight for you. And don't forget, the Saw is family.